have been discussing about the GE paper on environmental ethics, and we continue with the segment on the applications of sustainability with various examples that we had already been picking up with the framework of ecological restoration framework, and we continue this module further in today's lecture. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Today's theme is about operationalizing a Kamakhya-centered ecological restoration framework, and this is in a way a continuation of what we had discussed in one of our preceding lectures. Now, the methodological approach for operationalizing the Kamakhya-centered ecological restoration framework, which is also called as the KCRM, on the ground is discussed, where we would see that given that the framework integrates philosophical ethics, sacred ecology and environmental science, which is a purely quantitative or technocratic methodology, would just be self-defeating. So instead, this lecture today tries to adopt a mixed transdisciplinary and participatory methodology, combining ecological assessment with ethnographic, philosophical and community-based methods. Let us also be clear that the aim here is not merely to measure ecological change, but to translate ethical principles of the Rita, Dharma and the Prakriti into actionable restoration practices that are socially legitimate, culturally embedded and ecologically effective. So the research designed is made in such a manner where we would be delving into a transdisciplinary and participatory module. So our discussion today about the research paradigm here is grounded in a critical interpretative paradigm, recognizing that environmental degradation at sacred sites is both a material and a moral cultural phenomena. Knowledge is treated as situated and co-produced rather than experiment-driven alone or expert-driven alone. So this paradigm allows the integration of environmental ethics and philosophy, ecological restoration science, indigenous and local knowledge systems, religious and ritual practices. The case study or the applications that we have picked up is a continuation of the Kamakhya Nilachal Hill study, which is employed as a critical case study due to its dense sacred symbolism, active ritual calendar, ecological vulnerability, contemporary development pressures. The case study approach enables deep contextual understanding while allowing theoretical generalization to other sacred landscapes. Now, the first thing first, the phases of methodological implementation is divided into phase 1, where there is the ethical ecological baseline assessment, and this phase establishes the existing conditions through a dual lens. So when we are talking about ecological mapping, what is it that we are actually referring to? Ecological mapping talks about vegetation surveys vis-a-vis the native versus invasive species. It also talks about the soil stability and erosion mapping, hydrological flow and sacred water channels, biodiversity indicators, which is to do with the birds, the pollinators and other elements. The third or the second one is about the ethical cultural mapping. Now here there is a discussion about identification of sacred zones, taboo areas and ritual pathways. Documentation of oral traditions related to Nilachal Hills, mapping ritual calendars, example Ambubachi, and the methodological insight of ecological data as interpreted alongside cultural meaning, preventing reduction of sacred spaces to mere biophysical units is discussed. Phase 2 is about stakeholder identification and dharma mapping. Now what is this? Stakeholder groups are those that constitutes temple authorities and priests, local residents and traditional custodians, pilgrims and religious organizations, environmental scientists and planners, state agencies, and urban developers. Now, here in the Dharma mapping workshops, participatory workshops are conducted to identify perceived duties, responsibilities, and ethical limits of each group. This process translates Dharma into role-specific environmental obligations, reducing conflict and clarifying accountability. Phase 3 is about the co-designing of restoration interventions, where we deal with the sacred zonation planning, which is using the GIS combined with community input. The landscape is divided into core sacred ecological zones, ritual buffer zones, and sustainable interaction zones. So when we talk about the restoration techniques, let us understand that the native species reforestation aligned with sacred symbolism. We are talking about the soil bioengineering instead of concrete reinforcement, revival of traditional water harvesting structures, creation of non-intervention regeneration pockets. So the ethical filter here is that each intervention is evaluated for alignment with Ritta or the Dharma, duty, and Prakriti, natural regeneration. Phase 4 is about the ritual temporal integration, which is also called as the temporal planning. Here there is the suspension of heavy restoration work during Ambubachi, seasonal alignment with monsoon cycles, pilgrimage load regulation during ecologically sensitive periods. Time is treated as an ethical variable, not merely a logistical constraint. And phase 5 is the ethical pilgrimage and community participation, where we talk about pilgrimage as method, devotional tree planting rituals, waste-free offering protocols, educational signage, linking ecology and secret meaning, and pilgrims are incorporated as active participants in restoration rather than passive visitors. The other segment of methodology is the data collection methods, where there is qualitative methods. Now, the semi-structured interviews with priests, elders, and officials, the participant observation during rituals and festivals, focus group discussions with local communities helps. We also have the quantitative and the ecological methods of biodiversity indices, soil and water quality tests, visitor flow data, and waste audits. Further, there is also the data analysis, where we are talking about the thematic analysis for ethical and cultural data, comparative ecological analysis, the pre and post intervention, cross-validation between specific indicators and community perceptions, and this triangulation ensures ethical legitimacy and ecological credibility. We also have the monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive ethics, where it is about the indicators of success. And what is success? Ecological regeneration, vegetation cover, water quality, cultural acceptance and ritual continuity, reduction in ecological conflicts. Adaptive ethical review, annual ethical audits reassesses whether restoration practices remain aligned with sacred values and ecological realities. Then we also have the ethical consideration of the research, respect for religious sentiments and ritual confidentiality, informed consent and community ownership of data, avoidance of extractive research practices. Limitations of the methodology, negotiating plural religious interpretations, institutional resistance to non-technocratic models, long-term ecological outcomes beyond study duration, and these limitations are addressed through reflexivity and iterative engagement. So this methodology demonstrates that sacred site ecological restoration requires more than ecological expertise. It demands ethical translation, cultural listening, and participatory governance. By operationalizing the Rita, the Dharma and the Prakriti through phased inclusive methods, the Kamakhya-centered framework becomes a viable model for regenerative practice in culturally significant landscapes. Ultimately, this methodological approach reframes restoration as a collective moral practice, restoring not only ecosystems but relationships between people, place and the sacred. So we see that integrating the sacred ecology into heritage and environmental governance, the Kamakhya Nilachal Hills centered restoration model speaks up for here the sacred landscapes such as the Kamakhya Nilachal Hills of Assam represent a convergence of ecological sensitivity, cultural heritage and living religious practice. Current heritage and environmental governance frameworks address these domains in isolation, resulting in ecological stress, cultural erosion, and community conflict. Thus, this policy brief proposes a sacred ecology-based restoration model that integrates environmental science with culturally embedded ethical frameworks drawn from Indian philosophy, that is the Rita or the cosmic ecological order, Dharma, which is the contextual duty, and Prakriti, the living nature. The Kamakhya Center model demonstrates how sacred sites can function as ethical anchors for sustainable restoration rather than obstacles to development. We also have to discuss here, when we are talking about the ecological restoration framework, about the policy problem. Now, this is where we come to the fragmented governance phase. Environmental regulation focuses on biophysical metrics. Heritage management prioritizes monument preservation. Religious practices remain outside formal policy frameworks. This fragment leads to hill destabilization and hydrological disruption, overbuilt infrastructure in ecologically sensitive zones, public resistance and legitimacy crisis in development projects. However, the limitations of the conventional EIAs, the standard environmental impact assessment, is that they do not account for sacred temporality, which is the ritual calendars. They treat cultural practices as external variables. They fail to recognize sacred landscape as living ecosystems. So why then is the sacred ecology matters for policy? Let's understand that the sacred sites like the Kamakhya already functions as an informal conservation zones. It is a community regulated ecological spaces. It is a cultural mechanisms of restraint and care. Ignoring these dimensions weakens both environmental outcomes and social compliance. The Kamakhya-centered restoration policy framework, as we had discussed, Pillar 1 is all about sacred zonation in land use planning, which is the policy recommendation. So legally recognized sacred landscapes as graded ecological zones, core sacred ecological zones where there cannot be any construction, that is a no construction site, ritual buffer zones where there is low impact use, community interaction zones where there is regulated livelihoods. The policy impact is that it aligns the heritage protection with biodiversity conservation. Pillar 2, the ritual temporal regulation in development projects. The policy recommendation could be something like a mandate inclusion of ritual calendars, example the Ambubachi, in project timelines. Suspend high impact activities during ecologically and ritually sensitive periods. Policy impact reduces ecological stress and community opposition. Pillar 3, Sacred Ecological Impact Assessment, or the SEIA. The policy recommendation is or should be or could have been to introduce a sacred ecological impact assessment as a mandatory supplement to the EIAs or ecological impact assessment. So the minute we make the ecological impact assessment prefix with sacred for sacred landscape, we understand that it ought to assess the disruption of sacred hydrology, impact on ritual pathways and sacred sightlines, and effects on culturally enforced ecological rest cycles. Pillar 4, participatory governance as trust issue. So the policy recommendation should have been to establish multi-stakeholder sacred landscape councils including temples, authorities, local communities, ecologists, cultural scholars, government representatives. And the policy impact is it enhances legitimacy, compliance and adaptive governance. Pillar 5, the ethical pilgrimage management, where policy recommendation is to reframe pilgrimage policy from crowd management to ecological participation, waste-free ritual protocols and ecologically symbolic restoration activities. Visitor education on sacred ecology. Now, the implementation roadmap, which could be to 3 to 5 years. Year 1 could be about the sacred ecological mapping, stakeholder consultations, the plot of sacred ecological impact assessment guidelines. Years 2 to 3 could be a zonation enforcement, native restoration projects and pilgrimage reforms. Year 4 to 5 it could all be about monitoring and adaptive review, replication at other sacred sites. The expected outcomes, we see that it could lead to improved hill stability and water systems, reduced conflict between development and faith communities, strengthened heritage conservation, replicable national model for sacred landscapes. The broader applicability is the Kamakhya-centered model is transferable to hill temples, like the other examples could be Kedarnath, Sabrimala, or sacred riverfronts of Ganga, Yamuna, indigenous sacred landscapes across India. Thus, sacred landscapes are not governance challenges to be managed away. They are ethical infrastructures capable of advancing India's environmental, cultural and sustainability commitments. Integrating sacred ecology into heritage and environmental policy offers a low-cost, high legitimacy pathway to sustainable restoration in culturally complex landscapes. Now, we are good to go to compare the Kamakhya in dialogue with, say, other places as examples of Kedarnath, Sabrimala, Mecca and Uluru. Now, this section situates the Kamakhya Nilachal Hills within a global and Indian comparative framework of sacred sites that are simultaneously ecologically fragile, ritually active and politically contested. The comparison is not intended to homogenize diverse traditions, but to reveal how different sacred ontologies generate distinct environmental ethics, governance models and restoration challenges. Kamakhya is treated as the conceptual anchor against which Kedarnath, Sabrimala, Mecca and Uluru are comparatively analyzed. Now, with the Kamakhya of Assam, again, please let's revisit quickly the earth, fertility and the cyclical ecology is there, which means in the sacred ontology, the goddess is embedded in earth, rock, water and fertility. No anthropocentric ideal sacredness is materially grounded. Ecological ethic here is the cyclical temporality, Ambubachi menstruation of earth, ritualized ecological rest and pause. Governance challenge, hill destabilization, hydrological disruption, corridor style development. And the philosophical significance is definitely Kamakhya represents an ontological ecology where nature is not sacred because it symbolizes divinity, but sacred because it is divinity. Let's pick up the other examples of Kedarnath here in Uttarakhand. High altitude, fragility and cosmic order. Sacred ontology is Shiva as cosmic principle, Mahadeva, embedded in Himalayan geography. Mountains as abode of transcendence and austerity. Ecological ethic, emphasis on restraint, pilgrimage, hardship and minimalism. Alignment with the Rita through seasonal accessibility. The governance challenge here is post-disaster reconstruction and mass pilgrimage infrastructure, tension between disaster resilience and overdevelopment. Comparative insight is Kedarnath shares with Kamakhya is a sensitivity to cosmic order, Rita, differs in privileging ascetic transcendence over fertility and embodiment. Let's also pick up the Sabrimala Kerala example. It's all about forest ethics, vows and discipline. The sacred ontology is Ayappa as Nashika Brahmachari, forest or Vanam as a moral testing ground. The ecological ethic is the strict vratas or vows, abstinence, minimal consumption and humility. Pilgrimage as moral ecological discipline. Governance challenge, overcrowding, waste management and legal social conflicts. Comparative insight like Kamakhya, Sabrimala enforces ethics through ritual discipline. Unlike Kamakhya, it emphasizes control of the body, not celebration of fertility. Mecca, Saudi Arabia, sacred center and hyper-modern management. The sacred ontology, Kaaba as axial center of Islamic cosmology, Qibla, sacredness anchored in divine command and collective orientation. The ecological ethic is the stewardship or the khilafa and the trust amana principles. Emphasis on order, cleanliness and non-waste. The governance challenge is extreme scale of pilgrimage, Hajj, high carbon infrastructure heavy management. Now, the modern management comparative insight, we see that Mecca demonstrates maximum administrative control over sacred space. In contrast, Kamakhya relies on ritual temporality rather than permanent control. Also, there is this Uluru in Australia. In the indigenous ontology and ancestral law is about the sacred ontology here, where Uluru as a living ancestor within the dreaming, the land as law, story and being. The ecological ethic is the strong prohibition and respect-based conservation. Sacred restoration enforced through cultural authority. The governance challenge is colonial tourism legacy, balancing access with indigenous sovereignty. Comparative insight is Uluru is closest to Kamakhya in ontological sacredness of land itself. Both resist commodification through sacred prohibition. Now, if we look at the PPT being displayed here, we see that the site of Kamakhya, the ontology of nature and the ethical mode and the key ecological risk of governance model. For Kamakhya, for example, the ontology of nature is earth as goddess. The ethical mode is cyclical care. The key ecological risk is the hail and water stress, and the governance model is definitely ritual community. The other application that we have picked up as an example here is about Kedarnath, where the ontology of nature is mountain as cosmos. The ethical mode is austerity. The key ecological risk is climate and crowding, and governance model is state-led. Sabrimala, again, the ontology of nature is forest as a discipline. Ethical mode is about vows, and the key ecological risk is waste and excess. The governance model is mixed, legal. We also have the Mecca. The ontology of nature is space as command. The ethical mode is stewardship, and the key ecological risk is carbon and scale. The governance model is hyper centralized. Last but not the least is the Uluru site, where the ontology of nature is about the land as ancestor. The ethical mode is about prohibition, and the key ecological risk is tourism, and the governance model being indigenous custodianship. So this was about our brief comparative study analysis of the various examples of sacred sites, and we hope that ecological site restoration has given us certain insights vis-a-vis the ecological restoration. Now, the lessons for ecological site restoration are also important, which is number one model does not fit all. Sacred ontologies differ radically. Restoration must be ontologically sensitive. Number two, ritual time as ecological regulator. Kamakhya and Sabrimala demonstrate the power of temporal ethics over spatial control. Number three, governance legitimacy matters. Uluru shows that custodianship produces stronger ecological outcomes than access-based tourism. Number 4, scale requires ethical innovation. Mecca highlights the limits of infrastructure-heavy sustainability without deeper ethical restraint. So why Kamakhya matters globally? Kamakhya offers a rare ecological ethics where fertility is honored, not suppressed, Earth's vulnerability is ritually acknowledged, rest is institutionalized through culture. This makes Kamakhya uniquely suited as a philosophical and practical model for sacred site restoration in the Anthropocene. Thus, across cultures, sacred sites reveal that environmental ethics is most effective when grounded in belonging, restraint, and ontological respect. Kamakhya's earth-centered sacred ontology complements ascetic, legal, administrative, and indigenous models, offering a vital missing dimension to global sacred site governance, which is care through cyclical renewal. And this, when we talk about care through cyclical renewal, we must understand and appreciate that there are a lot of such examples and applications. However, for this lecture, we had placed the Kamakhya example as the central one and had posited it with the other mapping examples. With this, we end our lecture. We will be continuing more with the environmental ethics restoration in our next class. Thank you so much.